YouTube, and joining JT in Merchandise Paradise is author Simon Guerrier, talking about Doctor Who.
Hello, welcome back to Who's Views. It's Merchandise Paradise, and I am absolutely delighted today to be joined by writer and editor. You'll know him from BBC Books, from the Big Finish audio adventures, from comic strips, from countless other things as well. Please welcome to Who's Views. It's Simon Guerrier. Hello there.
Hello, Justin. Thank you very much for having me. It's very exciting.
I'm very excited to have you on. You're very, very welcome to Merchandise Paradise here at Who's Views, because on top of everything else that people might know you for, you're here primarily to talk about your brand new book that's available from 10 Alps. And I have to say, I'm really, really interested in this one, Simon, because this covers a gentleman that is, of course, what we'd like to... He's an enigma, really, isn't he, in Doctor Who circles, because you've written a book about David Whittaker, and there's the cover there. Brilliantly titled, Simon, David Whittaker in an Exciting Adventure with Television. I mean, that's a stroke of genius.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, so David Whittaker is he's a really important figure to Doctor Who. He's a really important figure to the fact that we're celebrating 60 years this month. I, like most people, know him for this Doctor Who in an Exciting Adventure with the Daleks, the very first ever Doctor Who novelization. Later republished by Target, but he was the first. There you go. There's the Target version. He was the first story editor of Doctor Who. He was involved in establishing a lot of the lore of the series. He commissioned the first Dalek story. He may have coined the term "exterminate" as the Daleks use. There's some evidence of that. He wrote more episodes in the 60s than anybody else. He's amazing, sort of foundational figure in Doctor Who, and yet we knew very little about him. He died in February 1980, when at that point Doctor Who fandom was really just getting going. Doctor Who magazine, it was Doctor Who Weekly at the time, had been going a couple of months. There had been a handful of Doctor Who conventions. Fanzines were beginning to interview people who were involved in the early period of Doctor Who, and they just missed him, basically.
They did, didn't they? Yeah. I mean, it's fair to say that I can't think of anybody that ever met him. And as fandom, because, as you say, it was in its infancy, we didn't get to meet him at all. So that's why he's this sort of mystery person as well. But as you're highlighting there, he is so important to the history of this show that we know and love.
Yeah. So amazing TV writer, Gary Hopkins, who wrote for things like the Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes and things like that.
Oh, fabulous.
Gary was a member of the Doctor Who Appreciation Society and had a fanzine of his own, the Doctor Who Review. And he's an amazing source for some of these early voices of people involved in the show. And he corresponded with David Whittaker and got one good letter from him, where David basically says, "Thanks for all your very specific questions, which I'm not going to answer. I'm just going to say everybody else was amazing." And he lists writers, actors, directors who he thinks were amazing. Which is very nice, but not very helpful. And then in 1986, Jeremy Bentham wrote this, The Early Years.
Early Years, yeah.
Amazing, very, very important source for us. And in that, he interviewed David Whittaker's first wife, his widow, who gave Jeremy a whole load of bits of information about David's life, his role on Doctor Who, and things like that. Unfortunately, not all of it is correct.
Okay.
So there are things that June thought about David's life and career that are not quite what happened. And so what we find is that lots of things that are repeatedly said about David Whittaker are not quite true.
Really?
So, for example, she said that he got into television because he was an actor. We know he was an actor in Rep. He was at York Rep, and she was at York Rep a few years after him. And she thought that he had written a play that was staged by York Rep that happened to be seen by somebody at the BBC script unit who thought we could put that on television, and offered him a job.
Oh,
So
right.
the suggestion being that he rather lucked into television by chance. That's not what happened. He was in Rep. He was looking at writing, but he was specifically looking at writing for television. And over a period of about 18 months, he sent the BBC all sorts of things. He sent them comedy sketches, he sent them comedy, like a one-off half-hour script that he thought would suit Petula Clark. He sent them a musical, he sent them all sorts of things. And before he got to Yorkshire Rep, he was at Colchester Rep with Pauline Devaney, who you see in the Looking for David documentary on the season 2 box set. And while he was at Colchester, one of the things he got, he had sent to the BBC, got commissioned and was shown. He then had a booking with York Rep, so he went off to do their summer season, and was amazing. Got amazing reviews for. He was in a school for Scandal, the Sheridan play, and got amazing reviews. But by the time, and he did sort of York in 2 bits. He did a couple of weeks, had a break, and had a few more weeks. In that break, he went and had a meeting with the BBC about selling them more scripts. Basically, he had some more ideas, and could he go in to discuss them? And they said, "We've got a job in the script unit if you want to apply." And that was the end of July 1957, and by October he was on staff.
Crikey. When I mean, you've obviously done an awful lot of research here. Why what interested you so much about David Whittaker to be able to say, right, okay, I want to put all this down in a book and get lots of all this cleared up?
So I've known of David Whittaker for a very long time. When I was 4 or 5 and Logopolis was broadcast and Tom Baker regenerated at the end, I was sort of, weirded out by the idea of other doctors. And my elder brother rushed upstairs and found his copy of the Doctor Who Monster book, which explains the sort of history of Doctor Who. And that, I read cover to cover daily for years. And on the back cover of that, it had this sort of photo montage of all the different Target books that were available.
That's right, yeah. Iconic now.
Iconic, which I stared at and stared at.
Yeah.
And David Whittaker is on David Whittaker's Dalek book, the one that you showed earlier, is sort of top left on that.
Yeah.
So I was aware of his name, and I saw his name on that book because I got that out of the library. And I read it, and I think I started The Crusade, but found that a bit hard going. And then Doctor Who Magazine 200 did a big series of features on him. So I kind of had a sense of who he was. But there wasn't really anything else. That kind of covered everything that we knew. But I found him a kind of beguiling, interesting figure. And then in 2016, I was researching one of his stories, The Evil of the Daleks. I wrote a book for the Black Archive series. And what I'd said to the Black Archive team was, I don't really have a pitch for this. What I want to do is kind of go on a fishing trip and research stuff and then tell you what I found. So I'd never been to the Written Archive Centre in Caversham, and I really wanted to go. So my pitch was, let me go and have a look at what's there and follow some links and whatever. And then I'll come back to you and tell you what I found. So that was the pitch. And one of the things that I found was the suggestion that elements in The Evil of the Daleks are based on his real life.
Really?
And I thought, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So there's a storyline for The Evil of the Daleks from the January 1967 when it's first commissioned, that features Victoria's mum in it. And Victoria's mother was called Anne, And Anne was David Whittaker's grandmother, who
Oh.
lived, and David Whittaker's grandfather lived in a house a few miles outside of Canterbury, as does Maxtable. And David Whittaker's middle name was Arthur, and he was named after his uncle. And there's a character called Arthur in the Evil of the Daleks. And I just thought there's something going on here. There's something linked to his family. So I just began to sort of look into it. Originally thinking this would suit a Doctor Who magazine piece or something, and it has. I've written a few Doctor Who magazine articles about bits and pieces I've turned out, but it just got bigger and bigger. And a bit like with Doctor Who, the more you look into it, the more fascinating it is. The more I've looked into David Whittaker's life, the more fascinating I found him.
So you were literally turning stones, as it were, to use that method. You were uncovering more and more and more.
Yeah,
I mean, what wasn't your mind blown at this particular point?
Yes, yeah, and it's been a series of that. So I sought, because of the interview with June Barry in the early years, I thought, well, I'll try and talk to her.
And just explain who June Barry was.
So she was David Whittaker's first wife.
Yeah.
They were married just before he started work on Doctor Who in the summer of 1963, and separated in. They got divorced in 1973, so they were married for 10 years. And I found out where she was in a care home, and sort of put in a request to interview her, and was told that wasn't going to be possible because she had dementia and wasn't really up to it.
Right.
But I talked to the care home, and I kind of said, look, I'm if there's any chance of speaking to any of the other family members or anything like that. So when she died in 2020, sadly, she was one of the early victims of COVID.
Oh, bless her.
Her cousin got in touch and said, I've had this request put through. And he, as well as going to the rather subdued funeral, had also collected all the bits and pieces that were in the care home. And they included her wedding album and letters from David and bits and pieces. So he said, I've got this stuff, really. So that opened things out a bit, and he was willing to share, and Peter's been amazingly generous. That the family have all been amazing, and he's in the Looking for David documentary. So I had these kind of pieces, and then Chris Chapman, the documentary producer, had kind of heard about this through the grapevine. So he got in touch and kind of said, look, we're thinking of doing a documentary about David Whittaker. How far have you got and what are you doing?
Yeah.
And I was kind of like, well, if you pay me as a researcher to do, I'll share everything I've got so far.
Yeah.
But if you pay me a bit as a researcher, I can go and do more. There are other avenues I haven't gone down yet. So that's what we did. We kind of followed up some more threads.
Wow.
And then about a month after we'd finished shooting that documentary, I made contact with David's nephew and niece. And it turned out that his niece had a whole box of paperwork. So
wow.
Yeah. So it's been, very exciting and really sort of it's kind of taken up the better part of the last 2 years, but I've been working on it since 2016. But I found out loads, and it's really changed my idea about what Doctor Who is. And,
oh, really?
And what the structures of it are, and where it all comes from, and all of that sort of stuff.
Well, I'll build on that a bit from what you've pieced together about this man, whom none of us knew. Yeah. So, what do you mean by that exactly? What has it taught you about the show?
So, if you go to Caversham, as various Doctor Who historians have done, there are various paper folders, card folders of production paperwork and things. And a lot of the history of Doctor Who is based on the general files. There are 2 general files that basically cover the first year of Doctor Who, from the setup for the pilot episode to the end of production on the Dalek invasion of Earth. The earliest dated documents in that folder are a report on the viability of science fiction for television, prepared by Alice Frick and John Braben.
Wow.
And it's from 1962, and they basically kind of say, if we've done Quatermass, we've done A for Andromeda. What is the potential for doing one-off plays where you adapt books of science fiction? And they say, and they basically come to conclusions of going, well, yeah, some would work, some wouldn't. Time travel seems to be would probably work on television quite well. Telepathy would probably work on television right well. Would work on television quite well. Stay the hell away from bug-eyed monsters.
Oh, really? Is that where it is?
so that's and it's a really important document, and because it's in the production folder,
yeah,
that was clearly a key influence on what Verity Lambert and David Whittaker and what Sidney Newman and people, all of these people who were there right at the beginning, what they were thinking about. That document or that report seems to have been commissioned by Donald Wilson, who was the head of the script unit, at the urging of a guy called Eric Maskowitz. And I think you've got a photo of Eric Maskowitz.
Yep. Is that this one?
That's him. That is Eric Maskowitz and his wife at David Whittaker's wedding in June 1963. So the fact that Eric Maskowitz was there at David Whittaker's wedding suggests a link between them. Maskowitz had been, between 1958 and 61, the head of light entertainment at the BBC. He's an extraordinary figure. He used to be the editor of Radio Times. He then left the BBC and went and worked in musicals. He wrote Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square.
Wow, yeah.
Amongst a number of stage musicals, as he wrote under the pseudonym Holt Marvel. Amazing career. Then basically came back to the BBC in the 50s and ran Light Entertainment, where effectively his script editor was David Whittaker, and they worked on all sorts of things together and were really close. So my suspicion is that Maskowitz's interest in science fiction, because there's nothing else in his rich and varied career that suggests an interest in science fiction. My suspicion is that might have come from David and their friendship, and that they talked about it. Even if it didn't, they would have talked about this and what it meant and what the ramifications were. But what was happening in light entertainment at the time that Maskowitz was there was a new kind of light entertainment program that David was all over, and that was called sitcom. And sitcom was an American format for television that the BBC watched very carefully and kind of went, we should be doing stuff like that. And ITV was doing it as well. And there's loads of paperwork from the late 50s and 60s about this. And what sitcom basically means you can do is the old way you'd have a comedy entertainer on stage is you'd have a comedian like Tony Hancock, who would kind of create a character that they'd perform on stage. And it might be based very much on themselves, or it might be a kind of invented character where they dressed up a bit, and they'd go out and they'd do their act, and they might maybe have 2 or 3 versions of that act at most, so that if they were in the same theatre for a run, they could vary it up a bit, and they might vary that act a bit and do topical jokes and stuff, but basically it would be the same thing each night. If you put that on television, they then couldn't use that act again because everybody had seen it.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So what sitcom did was you took that character and you put them in situations where they could have new reactions to stuff. And once you've done that, once you've basically gone, well, we'll take Tony Hancock's stage creation and we'll put him in a series of funny situations. Rather than having him appear once a year, you can have him do 30 episodes a year. You know, he can be on every week. And that meant that there was what sitcom allowed you to do was create this kind of material at volume. And so something like the Army Game that William Hartnell was in, they did 30 episodes a year, you know, or whatever, and just knocked it out. And then there was a film and there was a spin-off show that also had, you know, but Bootsy and Snudge had like 40, 50 episodes or whatever it was. And that worked really well. And I think that's what Doctor Who is. It's a drama series that you can have run for 40 episodes a year. It's the same length as a sitcom. It's half an hour. And what you do is you have these established characters and you keep putting them in new situations.
Mm.
And that's what that kind of format is effectively doing. At the same time, it's doing things. So David wrote a paper in 1962 on what to do with the BBC Sunday Night Play, which was the big prestigious drama thing.
Mm-hmm.
And his amazing insight there was not to say this is what the plays should be about or what topics we should cover. He basically said the problem that we've got is that nobody knows what they're about to see because it's so varied. What we need to do is impose a structure so that people have a better idea of what they're tuning in for. So he said, if you know, very simply, things like titles should be less opaque so that you know what you're going to get. And you can see him applying that to Doctor Who. So before David comes on board Doctor Who, the first episode of Doctor Who is called Nothing at the End of the Lane. What does that tell you about what's going to be on? Under David's regime, as script editor, story editor, that very quickly becomes An Unearthly Child, which tells you exactly what the thing is. There's a child and she's mysterious. It puts you on the position of the two teachers who are going, there's something strange about her. And that's the heart of the episode. So you know, just from the title, there's a mystery here. There's something unsettling going on. So it sets the tone. It gives you a sense of the plot. And you're kind of there with them. But also David was looking at things like the Sunday Night at the Palladium, the big variety show hosted by Bruce Forsyth.
Yeah.
And he basically says that has a series of different acts every week. But the audience always knows exactly what they're going to get because it always starts with a sort of a lesser band or pop group or variety act or something. They then pull members of the audience up onto stage to take part in a silly competition.
In the game,
in the game.
Yeah.
Bruce Forsyth then says, we're going to an advert break, but don't go away because when we come back, very excitingly, we've got, and it'll be the Beatles or Sammy Davis Jr.
The big star of the moment,
the big star.
Yeah.
And what that means is you have a structure you can put anything into that show, but you have a structure so that it's very familiar.
Yeah.
So it's continually innovative and yet utterly predictable. And David is basically going, that's what we kind of need. We need to have the tone of what we're producing needs to be consistent week to week. The titles need to tell us what they are. We should be using the same writers over and over again, so there's some consistency. We should be exploring one or two themes, and we might have 3 or 4 plays that all explore different aspects of the same theme or subject matter, so that there's a bit of regular stuff going on. All of these things you can see him applying to Doctor Who. They repeat, Terry Nation is a hit, let's employ him again. John Lucarotti is a hit, let's employ him again. This kind of building of Dennis Spooner is a hit, let's employ him again. In fact, let's make him the next story editor. All of these things are about, for all Doctor Who can go anywhere in time and space, for all it can be surprising, for all it can be weird, and you never quite know what's going to happen next. What he's really good at is building a structure that makes it that you know exactly where you are as an audience. So that first year, each episode feels very similar. It's all grounded in the regular characters. All of those things are really important to establishing the show as an ongoing success. And then there's a whole load of other things he does, which I detail in the book, all of which are about holding the audience and holding their attention. And if it wasn't, and I genuinely think that if anybody else had been in that role, the show wouldn't have lasted. Because of all the things that he did to make it endure.
I mean, listening to you talking about this now, this is fascinating because, you know, I'll admit it, I don't really know that much about David Whittaker. I know about what we've been told over the years, and I know he was there at the beginning. I know he helped to shape it. I know he worked with Verity and all this. I mean, I know he did 51 episodes between 63 and 64, and he was the first story editor. But all this other stuff that you've discovered, you know, and your theory there, it actually does hold a certain sense as well, doesn't it? Because that format came in and it stayed. Yeah. But you can't. Yeah, I can actually see what you're saying about. I mean, these people were professionals, and they were professionals at their time, so they would have been looking at all the other formats as what happens today.
Yeah, and it's the same as Russell T Davies going when he brings back Doctor Who in 2005.
2005, yeah.
He's thinking not how do I compete with Star Trek or whatever else. He's thinking our opposition is Ant and Dec.
Yeah.
We've got to hold an audience that's watching Ant and Dec or X Factor or whatever. And it's exactly that same kind of idea of the sort of context of the rest of the TV schedule on a Saturday night. And David had form in that, and he'd worked on, you know, light entertainment shows that got some of the highest ratings in the year. Yeah, so there's a clip
for the BBC, or did he?
For the BBC.
Yeah, so he didn't flip over to the other side then.
No, he didn't work for ITV until he'd left Doctor Who.
Right.
His first work for ITV was in 65.
Right. Okay.
When he worked for Robert Banks Stewart on a series called Undermined.
Wow. Okay. There's another familiar name for all of us. Wow.
Yeah. But yeah, so he worked on. On the Looking for David documentary. There's a clip of A Christmas Night with the Stars, which was the BBC's Christmas Day variety show.
Yeah.
Where what they basically did was they got all the big shows, all the stars of the big shows, to record a skit that would then be shown. So basically, nobody had to work on Christmas Day. That was kind of
yeah. Fair enough. Fair enough.
And David wrote the links for the presenter.
Oh, really?
And the 1958 one survives, but he did it every year for 3-4 years, seen by 12-13 million people.
Wow.
He wrote the links related to that. He wrote the links for music and dance shows, things like Make Mine Music and Showtime, which nobody remembers now, but were getting similar. You know, so the Sunday night dancing shows and music shows that had huge ratings.
Yeah.
And what he had to do was make those links funny, but not distract from the acts. So. And kind of get the information in, and so it's a really technical job, and he could do all that, and he would do shows where he did 2 productions at Riverside Studios, where Riverside Studios had 2 studios in it, Riverside 1 and Riverside 2. The same play would use both at the same time, so you'd have one studio for all the acting bits, and one studio being used for all the dance routines that needed.
No, really. Oh, Lord.
And then upstairs you'd have a live orchestra playing the music, with their music being played live, piped down into the studio so everybody could hear it and it could be recorded. And he was doing these extraordinary productions. Or he wrote for the magician David Nixon a lot.
Oh, right, yeah.
And David Nixon would be doing song and dance shows in Lime Grove at Studio D in Lime Grove, which had really limited basic facilities, but they'd be doing things like superimposition and things to make. So, you know, he'd make one of the performers shrink and stand on his hand and all of that sort of stuff. And you go, that's why when the first Doctor Who story was going to be what became Planet of Giants, that's why David was the guy that they put in it, because he was the guy who knew how to do those sorts of effects. And actually what he did was wrote a very stern letter to his bosses going, because I've done all these shows, I know Lime Grove isn't suitable. We can't do Planet of Giants until we get into Television Centre.
You see?
And that's why it's put off for you.
And I see. Right. So they actually listened to David Whittaker.
Well, wow. he wasn't the only one saying it. Donald Wilson, who was then head of serials, was saying it, and Sidney Newman was there. David was the one who certainly had the sort of practical experience of it. And effectively, they used Planet of Giants and Dalek Invasion of Earth as kind of bargaining counters to get better facilities.
Good
And they
for them.
basically, well, we'd love to do the miniaturization story, and we'd love, which Sidney Newman came up with. We'd love to have the Daleks come back, but we can't do that until we get.
We can't do this in a shoebox.
Exactly, and that kind of bargaining is going on all through early 1964. There's a lot of paperwork relating to it.
Wow. And to see that paperwork and to troll through that paperwork, it must be not just joyous, but a nightmare. I had no idea, actually, Simon, that, he was, I mean, obviously you can tell he comes as a career, but talented. I didn't realize he had that sort of career where he was actually just so involved with all these various platforms of the industry and entertainment. I mean, this is fantastic to hear. What a talented guy.
And this is what I mean. Once you start getting into that, it just completely opens up your idea of what Doctor Who is and what it fits into and how it came about and what the positions are. And Verity Lambert and Sidney Newman were both very new at the BBC. David and Mervyn Pinfield were the associate producer, were the two kind of established figures. Mervyn Pinfield was brilliant on the technical side of things. Everything from, so this is the guy who invented auto cue. He also he's basically the guy who's going to be behind the TARDIS dematerializing effect. He's going to know about how to do sound effects with the Radiophonic Workshop. He's going to know, all of that kind of stuff. My sense is, and I don't mean to denigrate him at all, because I think he's a really important and influential figure. My sense is he wasn't on the dramatic side of it. It was more the technical side of how things could be done.
Okay.
And what David really brought to Doctor Who is the feel of it and the kind of plotting. And nobody else liked the Dalek story. And David is the one who's enthusing about it. And there's a lot of evidence that he's the one going, not only is this a really good story and really exciting, and the scripts are good, but we should bring it forward in the schedule because it's good. And also we should write off everything else we had planned and commission a whole load of stories that are like this with monsters.
Oh.
And he's doing that before the Daleks has been on to some extent, but he's definitely doing it once it's on and people can see how successful it is. So they junk Malcolm Hulke's The Hidden Planet. They delay and then ultimately cancel Anthony Coben's The Robots. They can't get rid of Planet of Giants because it's Sidney Newman's idea and he's the boss.
Yeah, they have to have that one,
which and by the time you get to Planet of Giants, if you watch them in order, you do kind of go, this is odd, because it's basically Doctor Who as it was originally conceived, but it's become something else.
It's a good point, actually. Yeah, you see, I could see it now. Yeah.
And you get to Dalek Invasion of Earth and you go, yeah, this is what Doctor Who's now going to be.
Yeah.
And he's the guy, working with Verity Lambert, supported by Donald Wilson and Sidney Newman, but I think that's him.
Is there anything that you found that would suggest how he got on with Verity, for example? Because as you said, Verity was very new into the BBC at this point. This was her first production as a producer. She had to work with all these established men around it here as well. So have you uncovered anything about which could sort of hint at what their relationship was like?
Yeah, a few things. It's really difficult because David doesn't have a voice in this. He wasn't interviewed. He didn't get to say anything.
No.
Verity Lambert could be very guarded in interviews about what she said. She was always very professional about what she said. There are, we know she fell out with other people.
Yeah.
Mostly because of what they have said. I think there's a DVD commentary where she and Richard Martin talk about rowing in the studio or whatever, or having cross words. But we've kind of got a gap in the record about her and David. She's always very, in anything she said about him, she was always very respectful and said how talented he was and useful and how much she relied on him. I've spoken to a few people who knew them, who all said they were like this, they're just together on everything. And what tends to come across is that David was very quiet, and Verity Lambert would, as the producer, would make the decisions and things, but she and David would talk a lot. So
Right.
effectively, she was in charge, but they were in tandem. And I think that in itself is remarkable, because she was a 26, 27-year-old woman, new at the BBC on her first producing job.
Yeah.
And he was quite experienced. And I think it says a lot about his character, especially for the time, that he just did that. But he'd worked with several women producers before.
Oh, he had?
Yeah. He'd so his very first TV play, A Choice of Partners, from June 1957, was produced and directed by Joy Harrington, who's very well respected. She produced Jesus of Nazareth, which was an extraordinary BBC production in the mid-50s, where they filmed in Galilee and Jerusalem. Very well lauded.
I've never heard of that one.
Yeah, and she then did Paul of Tarsus, which was a sort of follow-up that Patrick Troughton was in.
Right.
She is in, if you've seen the John Mills Quatermass,
yes,
from the late 70s, at the beginning he's in a TV studio being interviewed. She's the director in that.
No, really? I'll have to go back and look at that.
And it's a sort of in-joke, because Nigel Neal and his wife Judith Kerr, who were both at the BBC in the 50s, knew her. And she had been an actress. So yeah.
That's lovely, though, isn't it? When little nods like that happen professionally, you know, just come in and just be in this film for a little while. That's really quite nice. It's nice to know, though, that, you know, that relationship was there.
Yeah,
and between those two.
Waris Hussein told me.
Yeah.
I mean, he said he didn't really have very much to do with David Whittaker. He mostly dealt with Verity Lambert.
Well, yeah.
But he said they always got on very well. And I you know, one of the things I was kind of bracing for in researching this was that I'd find out that David was a, you know, terrible sexist, or
a man of his time,
or a drunk, or, you know, or racist, or whatever.
Yes.
And Waris has talked about in quite a few interviews, you know, that people were openly hostile to him and this sort of stuff, and said things just out of his hearing about him or about Verity Lambert or whatever.
Yeah.
So I kind of, you know, tentatively said, was David one of them? And Waris Hussein said, no, never. You know, he might, as he said, he might have said things about me behind my back that I didn't hear, but he was always the perfect gentleman and very charming. And that's kind of what I've heard from most people. And to be honest, when the record suggests otherwise, I think that's more telling of the other people. You know.
Yeah. I get what you're saying there. I get what you're saying. So as you're going through all this information that you're uncovering, and obviously by this point you're thinking, right, there's a lot here I can write about. There's a book in this rather than a series of articles. This is a book. What else did you unearth about this gentleman that was so important to the origins of Doctor Who that you can tell us? Don't give us too much away, because we want people to go and look at the book.
Okay, so so we'd finished looking for David. You know, we finished shooting it and it was off being edited. And I'd said to Chris Chapman, look, I've made contact with David's family and they've got some bits and pieces. And Chris said, well, look, we've got so much stuff already. We can't, and we haven't got the budget to go and film anymore. And
of course. Yeah.
It's very difficult. Yeah. He was brilliant. He made Chris pulled out all the stops on that documentary, and extraordinary piece of work it is. But he was kind of like, you know, I'd be interested in knowing what they have, but I'm not sure we can fit them in and stuff. So I went to see David's niece, Melanie, and the first thing she told me was, she said, I've got this box of paperwork and I've been through it looking for stuff, but I can't find anything on paper that says that David came up with the title Doctor Who, but I think he did.
Okay.
And I was like, okay. So Yes, and
Oh
so
dear.
so I've got to, I've followed up what she told me, and I've looked for things that can corroborate that. I'm not sure there's anything that I don't think apart from her account, I don't think there's any compelling evidence to rewrite the history as we know it. I think it's a really interesting suggestion. I think it fits,
Okay.
but I'm not sure. But I've got nothing to prove it. I've got
Yeah.
nothing.
Yeah. Well, the problem
evidence
is we now know they didn't document things like we do today, where everything's down in triplicate. They were just being creative, weren't they?
Well, the problem with Doctor Who is there's an awful lot of paperwork.
Mm.
So bits of it is extremely well documented, but there are
Right.
gaps.
Yeah.
And there are some pivotal gaps. So there's paperwork from March 1963 where they first have meetings about Sidney Newman wanting to do a science fiction series. And then there's a gap from sort of the end of March to about midway through May
Right.
when they go, here's this series called Doctor Who.
Oh, I see.
And there's a kind of 5 or 6 week gap where you kind of have to deduce what happened, and there's a little bit of a mention here or whatever.
Yeah.
So I've in the book I pieced that together and put
Fantastic.
my suggestions of what went on.
Wow. So that's going to be interesting reading as well, that little bit. But of course, David, when he finished with Doctor Who at 64, as the story editor, that wasn't to the end of his association. Mr. Whittaker did carry on in various forms. So was there anything that you uncovered about his time after his time as story editor with the show?
Yeah, all sorts of things.
Oh, great.
So
and they're all in the book.
Yeah, they are all in the book. So I think I know what inspired the power of the Daleks.
Oh, okay.
I think so. The power of the Daleks, quite a lot of the plot, the Dalek bit of the plot, owes quite a lot to the stage play, The Curse of the Daleks, that had been on stage the Christmas before. But the setting of the power of the Daleks is on this colony world, Vulcan.
Yeah.
And I think the clue is in the word colony. I think David was thinking specifically of Kenya.
Oh.
And I think I know why that is and what sparked that thought. And I think it's the sales of The Edge of Destruction to Commonwealth countries. And he was receiving chits with the royalties that he'd receive as they were broadcast in each country or sold to each country. And just at the time that he is discussing with story editor Jerry Davis, what the plot of this Dalek story should be, he gets a chit about Doctor Who being shown in Kenya. And I kind of go into this in more detail in the book.
Yeah.
But I think what he was thinking about was the incongruity, the juxtaposition, and David was really into juxtapositions of the TARDIS landing in the middle of Kenya. So it's a hot country that has sort of an uprising, and the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya was very much on people's minds, and had all sorts of. Sidney Newman, for example, had seen a news report about a housewife in Kenya during the Mau Mau rising, and that was what inspired the character of Kathy Gale in the Avengers. This very tough woman.
Wow.
And I think David was having similar thoughts about, imagine if you just drop the Daleks and Doctor Who into this kind of potent mix. As I said, I think The Evil of the Daleks owes bits and pieces to his mum's family. I think The Enemy of the World owes quite a lot to the first thing David wrote on staff for the BBC, which similarly had an actor playing two roles. And the various other bits and pieces about The Enemy of the World, I think we can trace what David originally wrote for that. Yeah, I think I mean, all of those things, kind of where things come from and what they're influenced by. What I think is also quite interesting in seeing his later work is, I think I mentioned that he wrote a series. He wrote 2 episodes of a series called Undermined for Robert Banks Stewart.
Yeah.
I think there's an episode of that in which Barry Ingham, who's Alidon the Thal in the first Dalek movie,
Yeah.
and then is I think was he Paris in the Mythmakers? He's definitely in the Mythmakers.
He's in the Mythmakers, yes. Can't remember the character name, but yeah.
Well, those were both 1965. In between those 2 jobs, he plays a posh bully for David Whittaker in an episode of Undermined, and he's amazing. It's a fantastically written and fantastically played part where he's a very well connected posh public school guy in a pinstripe suit and bowler hat who uses his connections to get what he wants. And when he doesn't get what he wants, he turns really nasty. And it's extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. But it's also one of the first things David wrote, having left the BBC, where he didn't have all the sort of Oxbridge connections that everybody else had, or that seemed to be very prevalent. And I think there might even be some commentary on, what he's left behind and stuff. It's a really interesting one. It's that thing of, once you know the kind of context of what was going on at the BBC at the time and how he fitted into that, you see that episode and you go, surely this is him with an axe to grind. And then he wrote an episode of another ITV series, Mr. Rose, that is all about it's about an old gentleman's club and possibly changing the rules to allow new people to come in.
Oh, I see.
And they're all against it. And it's all about this, again, it's all about the establishment and the establishment looking after itself. And that they all seem to be very gentlemanly, but actually they're not.
Yeah, yeah.
And again, that all kind of ties to, so, and that's got, that episode has got John Bailey in it, who is also Edward Waterfield in The Evil of the Daleks.
Yeah.
And was also in the Forsyte Saga with David's wife at the same time. And so you see all these kind of connections and things.
It's amazing, isn't it? That it's all. This is what you can find from all this, all the notes that are around, and all any letters that are around, anything like that.
Yeah, it's partly that. It's partly talking to people.
Yeah,
anybody I could find who knew him.
How difficult was that, by the way?
Very hard. We are on the cusp of living memory.
Yes, that's what I'm thinking. Yeah. It must have been.
Oof. Yeah, and so what I found was I spoke to a guy called Clifford White, who was on the camera crew of Showtime, one of the variety shows that David worked on.
Right.
Clifford couldn't remember David Whittaker at all.
Oh.
But as he said, I wouldn't have mixed with the writer, But what he could tell me was what the atmosphere was like on set and what it felt like and how complicated it was.
Yeah.
And also he could tell me things like they all had to wear, even him operating the dolly on the crew had to wear a suit and tie.
I knew you were going to say that. Yeah.
And the only,
those were the days, Simon.
Yeah, and the only concession was that they had a budget. They were given money as staff. The BBC gave them money so that they could go out and buy soft-soled shoes, which basically meant they wore trainers because they would then be silent on the concrete floors.
Of course.
On set.
Perfect sense, actually. That makes. Oh, wow.
And he also said you weren't allowed to smoke on the set, because the smoke trails would be seen. So he said the director and the producer up in the box, they'd all be smoking and chain smoking. So he said there was kind of like a hierarchy. You could see the hierarchy by everyone was wearing suits, but people wore better suits if they were more well off. But it was the shoes that gave your position away.
Yeah.
And also if you were smoking indoors. And it's like, oh, okay. So there's this all of those kind of social structures, and stuff, which gave me a real insight into the world that David walked in, even if we couldn't remember him.
Yeah. It is all amazing stuff. This is why, obviously why you called this David Whittaker in an exciting adventure with television, because he was so involved. And we have to remember as well that in the late 50s, when he gets there and through into the 60s, television is still in its infancy. You know, they're still, I mean, you can see it in various Doctor Who's of the early days. It's a very theatrical style setup. Performances are very theatre. You know, there's all this element into it. You know, it still stays there into some of the 80s there, really, as well, where you've got this theatritrical setup.
Yes.
But these were pioneers of television.
Exactly. So Asa Briggs, he wrote he was a historian. He wrote a huge 5-volume history of the BBC, very well respected. David Whittaker gets mentioned in it once, and that's fine. You know,
better than nothing.
Yeah. John Law, who was David's successor as script editor of Light Entertainment, John Law, who co-wrote the Class sketch with the two Ronnies, and you know, amazing writer, worked on all sorts of things. Doesn't get mentioned at all. But you know, but that's how these things work. But Asa Briggs says that television becomes an art form as a result in 1958 of them buying an Ampex telerecording machine, which means that you could record stuff in advance. Now they used that machine on things like A Christmas Night with the Stars to pre-record bits and then stitch it together. But Asa Briggs says it comes into its own when whenever it was 1960, they are having problems with one of their stars who gets stage fright. And as a result of this, they start pre-recording Hancock's Half Hour.
Oh, right.
Once they start pre-recording Hancock's Half Hour, they realize they can do a couple of things. One of which is they can go back and do things again.
Yes.
And polish the performance. They can also record reaction shots and slot them in the edit, so that Hancock can punctuate funny lines with a reaction, which makes the episodes funnier. And then they can repeat those episodes.
Yes.
And what you create is a cultural icon. So it's a much more polished program as a result of this technology, and you can repeat it and it embeds itself in the consciousness.
Lord.
And as Briggs says, Hancock's Half Hour, 2 decades after Tony Hancock died, still seems very modern, because it kind of introduced the language of doing sitcom and comedy. But also it's repeated all the time, so we're really familiar with it, and it draws a big audience. So it creates these kind of icons and stuff. And that is exactly the period that David is working in, and Doctor Who is part of that kind of new art form. It's a new kind of television that is using these things. And Sidney Newman was right behind that. He wanted Doctor Who to use the most pioneering technology, to be a show effectively about television. And BBC management went, yeah, that's fine, but you've got to do it at Lime Grove, where nothing works.
Nothing exists. Oh, God, love them. They must be. I mean, we know they were frustrated. You know, I mean, it's well catalogued through people like Warris and Verity. Newman himself even said it was very frustrating being down there. But wow, it must have been a very disappointing time. And when they were seeing all these other things coming across, and all this technology that was going on over the way, basically, you know, wow, they must have all been.
But I think what David brought to it was that he knew the limits of what you could do, how many sets you could fit into that space, what you could shoot, what was reasonable. So he wrote and made sure all the scripts were right on the limit of what was possible, with the best will in the world to his successor Dennis Spooner. I think in season 2, as you watch the Blu-ray, Dennis Spooner doesn't have that skill. Things like the Web Planet and the Chase are kind of pushing the ambition beyond what can be realized in a convincing way. And also, he's not so keen, you know, he's not so hot on a consistent tone week by week, and all of those kind of things. And I really mean it. I love Dennis Spooner's stuff. I love the Romans. I love the Time Meddler and stuff. But I think as a story editor, he's not got that kind of the practical end of the writing is not quite as hot. And I think you can see it. And I think he gets it by the end. And you know and with a director like Douglas Camfield on the Daleks master plan, you have this really gritty and exciting thing that's really pushing week by week what you can do.
Yeah.
But there's a sort of faltering period that I find useful because it's very revealing of what actually David brought to Doctor Who.
That's interesting that you should say that, actually, because it's when you look at his work and then you look at what happened afterwards, you can get a flavour of his personal character and how he approached things. That's an interesting thing to say. I mean, we've touched on the fact that Whittaker did stay involved on and off with Doctor Who. He did various stories. He had a relationship with Terence Dicks as well, didn't he? You know, so was there anything that you found out about that element when he came back to work with Terence?
So my great regret in this book, if I have a single regret about this book, is that I spoke to Terence Dicks in 2017, I think, about this.
Okay.
But for a Doctor Who magazine article. So I only asked him a bit. And I really regret that I didn't talk to him about this at greater length.
Yeah.
So as I think is quite well known, The Ambassadors of Death, David's last credited work on Doctor Who, is not really written by him. He delivered 3 scripts. They were taken off him and he was paid off. And Trevor Ray and largely Malcolm Hulke rewrote them.
Yeah.
And we can't really be sure how much of what is left was David's. No, there's no paper trail to really tell us definitively how much is there, except that in the summer of 1970, after The Ambassadors of Death had been broadcast, Terence Dicks wrote David a letter, which David kept and is in the file of papers that he's found with me. And I think I sent you a picture. Yes, there it is. I mean, this is the original, which David had held on to, and which
it's interesting that he kept this particular letter, isn't it?
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, this letter was known about because there's a copy of it in the BBC files for the Ambassadors of Death at Caversham at the Written Archive Centre.
Yeah.
So this is referred to in various, histories of Doctor Who and things. But as you say, the fact that David kept it is really interesting because he doesn't seem to have replied. Caversham, if he had replied to Terence Dicks, unless he'd basically told him where to go, that reply would have been filed along with.
Of course, it would have done. Yeah.
But
interesting.
What that letter is doing is basically saying, I know it's been difficult, but with exquisite manners. But David basically says, it got very good viewing figures, and I'm sure that that's down to the strength of your original storyline.
It's interesting how Terence starts the letter. Now the tumult and shouting has died.
Yeah, because so it was a miserable period, an absolutely miserable period. And what Terence told me was he said this haunted him, and he was massively embarrassed by the way David Whittaker was treated. He was a very experienced writer. He had been the chair of the Writers' Guild, so was very well respected in the industry. He was the first story editor of Doctor Who, so Terence was basically like, who are we to tell him what to do on Doctor Who? All of this kind of stuff. And Terence basically said, and Derek Sherwin and Peter Bryant, who were in charge of Doctor Who, treated him very badly. And they'd say, we want X. David would deliver X, and then they'd go, that's not what we want. And they left it to their assistant script editor, Terence Dicks, to deal with him. And it wasn't the only person that they treated like that. He was, Bryant and Sherwin fell out with several writers.
Right.
But I think what's really noticeable is when Terence Dicks wrote that letter, because at the same time that he wrote to David Whittaker, he was also in contact with all the other writers from the 1970 series of Doctor Who, so series season 7, to recommission them for the next series. So Robert Holmes, Malcolm Hulke, and Don Horton all write for season 8.
Yeah.
And I suspect that if David had written back to Terence Dicks and gone for a drink and cleared the air, instead of the Claws of Axos or the Demons, there would have been a David Whittaker story.
Wow.
The only thing...
Maybe he knew that. Maybe Whittaker knew that.
Possibly. Possibly. The only thing that stood in the way was that Terence Dix's new producer, Barry Letts, was the director of The End of the World, and he and David Whittaker had not got on that, and Barry Letts had demanded rewrites. So maybe David Whittaker was just kind of like, I should move on anyway, and I'm not very happy, and I'm not going to go back.
Which would be understandable from what we know about what happened production-wise.
Yeah, and then the other thing that leads me to is that a few months after that, so On the Mind of Evil, which was commissioned from Don Horton for season 8, they included a bit of the Doctor seeing very briefly a Dalek, and the production team got permission from Terry Nation to include a Dalek for the first time since David's Evil of the Daleks. And that led to a conversation about maybe we could have the Daleks back in Doctor Who. About the time that was all agreed, David had just moved to Australia. I suspect if he hadn't, he would have been the first choice to write the Dalek story if Terry Nation wasn't available. Because he was the only other person who'd written Dalek stories other than Terry Nation.
Of course. And that makes perfect sense. And Terence, of course, because of his passion, his love, his knowledge of the show, even at that point, very early days, series 7 and 8, he would have known that. He would have absolutely have known and respected that.
And it may be a coincidence, but the person they got in instead was Louis Marks, who had written Planet of Giants, which was the story that preceded the Dalek invasion of Earth. So he was part of that season 1, that first production block group. And maybe because of Planet of the Giants, he was known to Terry Nation and whatever. I don't know. But that all of that seems, seems connected.
Oh God.
Yeah, and I really regret. And Terence knew David Whittaker in later life, in the late 70s.
Right.
And because David and Malcolm Hulke were working together in sort of 78, 79, just before Malcolm Hulke died. And I really regret that I didn't.
Well, so do I.
I didn't know it at the time, but I really wish I'd asked him more.
Oh wow, yeah, because he probably would have told you as well, wouldn't he? At that point, goodness me. Well, what can you do? What I mean, you had the job to do at the time, and you did it. But it's very interesting. I mean, this is what we do as fans, isn't it? We can speculate. I mean, I know it can lead us to all sorts of conspiracy theories and trouble and down various dark alleys, but that's what we do. And it's interesting to hear because you've had these bits of insights in the research, and to see that letter from Terence. For myself, it's when he wasn't keeping anything else, Whittaker kept that particular letter. I mean, there must have been some reason or some, I don't know. It's very odd, isn't it?
There's very little relating to Doctor Who in his archive. I mean, there's a box of paperwork, and amongst that, there's maybe 10 bits of paper relating to Doctor Who. Most of it, the contracts for the novelization of the Evil of the Daleks that he never wrote. Because he signed it in December 1979 and died in the following February.
Oh, bless him.
It may be that there was more and it's disappeared over time. It may be that that's the sort of thing that people have helped themselves to. One intriguing thought is there's a bit in The Making of Doctor Who, the book that Terence Dix and Malcolm Hulke wrote in 1972. Where they quote a line from David Whittaker, and it says something like, David Whittaker once wrote, and the Doctor says something about how exciting it is to travel in space and time.
Okay, yeah.
But it's not in any episode. So Malcolm Hulke, I know, was corresponding with June Barry, David Whittaker's then wife, because David was in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
My suspicion is that what that means is that Malcolm Hulke went round to June Barry's house and took a draft script, and it's a line from a draft script, probably my guess is of The Rescue, and it's from the speech where the Doctor says to Vicky,
oh no, what are you doing? What are you doing? I mean, wow, this is mind-blowing.
So, but whatever it is, it's a document we don't have anymore. But what that suggests is it's one of a number of missing draft scripts. We also know that David delivered episode 1 of The Evil of the Daleks with Ben and Polly in it, because that's why the first 2 episodes are set in London, because their contracts, Annika Wills and Michael Kraser's contracts, ended with episode 2 of Evil of the Daleks, so he was commissioned to write them out. And yeah, so those scripts were that at least episode 1, possibly episode 2, were written. Those don't survive, so we don't know how they were written out. And we don't know what of the Ambassadors of Death is his. So you know, we have missing episodes of scripts, basically.
Which is that's another show in itself, then, isn't it? Really? I mean, wow. I mean that is. I mean, there could be hundreds of those sort of things, but that is quite interesting to know.
But I think I know what might have happened to those missing scripts, sadly. So in 1988 and 1990, the fanzine DWB published 2 editions of a photo novel. Basically, they got when they interviewed Christopher Barry, the director of The Power of the Daleks, he revealed he had the telesnaps from that story, and shared them. And DWB published the telesnaps and what photos they had from the story with the storyline, and to avoid, you know, problematic things like copyright, they made it a charity production, and all money went to the cancer charity. And David had died of cancer.
Yes, that's right.
And when they sent the check to David's first wife, June Barry, wrote an introduction for that, in exchange for which she received a check to pass on to the cancer charity. And the cancer charity wrote back to her, and she kept the letter, but had torn it up, which is a weird thing. There it is. That's what survives. So that was amongst her.
What does this tell us?
But it's not the only thing that was torn up in the boxes of paperwork that June's cousin Peter Jordan still has. He gave me these, which I'll hold up for you to look at. But lots of similar square bits of paper. Now I've put these together and pieced together what they are.
No.
This is the camera script from one of the episodes of the Rescue.
Really?
We have a copy of the script of The Rescue, so we're not missing anything in amongst these that we don't already have. It's exactly the same. I have checked. But what June's cousin thought June had done was she'd tear up scrap paper like this, and it would be by the phone, and they'd use it for notepaper.
Yeah, that's what they used to do there, wasn't it? I see. So what she could have done with this letter is it was just a letter. She's torn it out to put in the notepad file.
So the chances are that first episode of The Evil of the Daleks that featured Ben and Polly, those first drafts of the Ambassadors of Death, that's where they went. Sadly.
I'm laughing at it, but it's heartbreaking, actually. But you know what? You know, that's what they used to do, wasn't it? It would tear that out, put it down, and you... Oh, no.
But at the same time, she'd kept the rehearsal scripts for the first 4 episodes of The Power of the Daleks.
Right. Which
she provided to John Peel. She let Virgin Publishing have when John Peel was novelising it.
Yeah.
So we've got those. Those survive.
Yeah.
And they're really interesting because they include all the original plans for Patrick Troughton's Doctor before he and Sidney Newman made him a cosmic hobo.
Right.
So he's basically got more lines and he's a bit more cerebral, but also he says he's regenerated before.
Oh, well, crikey.
And he tells us a little bit about what the pre-Hartnell Doctor was like.
Oh, we won't go into that one because that'll set various people off now going, oh, no. Yeah. Oh, my goodness me. But it was never broadcast, so it doesn't count.
Well, you know, but it's really interesting. It's really interesting that they were thinking in those, you know, something that feels like is quite a new idea. David Whittaker was on in 1966. So and back then, of course, it would have all been about the mystery still about this and recreating this character and making that first change
normal for
Yeah.
that character, you know, where it wasn't so normal for the audience. He's basically going, "Oh, please, this is all hat for me." Interesting.
Yeah, so he kind of goes, "Yeah, the last time I did this, I was wearing an earring." He says, "One earring."
Yeah.
And it's just like, oh right, so kind of some kind of Francis Drake pirate type.
A pirate, yeah. Well, that was mooted, wasn't it? That you should look at something piratey. So yeah, you never know.
Exactly,
You never know.
exactly. So,
was there anything that you covered about David that came as a surprise?
oh yeah, loads of things. I mean, you know, I've said his niece saying that he came up with the title "Knock Me for Six."
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that really got me was I read this, which is the first Dalek.
Oh, look at you with that! Wow.
Yeah, it's not going to cover. It's not got a back cover, and it's in a right old state, and the pages fall out. But
well, it is 60 years old.
Yeah, but it was also £4 as well in a amazing.
Oh, congratulations! What a steal!
Yeah,
that's amazing. For anybody that's watching that doesn't know, that is the first piece of Doctor Who merchandise, and it's the Dalek book.
And it's
I've never seen one out of a glass case, mate.
Yeah, and I'd read a scan of it. But it's, you know, like an annual. It's a mix of comic strips and short stories and puzzles and whatever. But it begins with this amazing folder.
Oh wow! Look at that.
As the Daleks invade the solar system.
Yeah.
And then the comic strip that follows shows us conquering the different planets of the solar system, Venus and Jupiter, with all the life on it.
Yeah, lovely.
Not Earth, because that's what's happening on TV.
Yes.
And then it details the efforts of these young people to fight back. And
wonderful artwork as well. Stunning.
Richard Jennings, who previously worked on the Eagle, and amazing. And I think this is a big influence on the first Dalek movie and the look of it and the visuals of it.
Yeah.
But what you get is things like this. So here's another of the comic strips.
Beautiful.
And it ends with one of our heroes basically sneaking into the city of the Daleks and finding a secret document.
Oh.
And you turn over the page.
Yeah.
And that's the secret document.
The Anatomy of a Dalek.
So the feature on the Anatomy of the Dalek follows from the comic strip. And then you go into a story where, having got this information, they then go on and have a weakness against the Daleks so that it leads to the next story. So effectively what you've got is all the stories, or pretty much all the stories and the bits of the annual, all fit together to tell a story about the invasion of the solar system, which more or less, not quite perfectly, but more or less dovetails with the Dalek invasion of Earth on television.
Yeah. So you reckon that David had a hand in that whole universe, really, that whole mythos there?
And it's credited, the Dalek book, to David Whittaker and Terry Nation.
Oh my goodness.
In that order, suggesting he did most of the work.
Yes, yeah.
And
wow.
And once you get onto that, you're like, there's something very sophisticated going on there. That kind of multimedia thing.
Yeah.
But also the stage play that they did in 1965-66, the Curse of the Daleks, kind of dovetails with the first two Dalek stories. It almost fits in between them. Not, I think, because it was aiming to dovetail with the two TV stories. I think it was trying to dovetail with the two movies.
Wow.
And at the time that the play was on, David was working on in a credited role on the screenplay of the second movie.
He was, yeah.
Which started filming about 2-3 days after the play came off stage. And all of that I find really fascinating.
He was ahead of his time.
Yeah, it's what you do now.
It's what they're all doing now, and they're all trying to do now. And here's David Whittaker doing it in the 60s.
Yeah. Just amazing, absolutely amazing.
It shows how clever he was, really. You know, I mean, you know, because from what you're saying there, it looks like this was all in his head. This is happening there, and this is and I'll put that into that, and that can lead into the. I mean, he must have been going frantic with all these saying ideas about these Daleks, you know.
And I think that's what I find amazing. And he was really prolific. He you know, he had hundreds of credits to his name, let alone Doctor Who. And so all of that I just find absolutely fascinating. But all of those things, you know, all of that kind of stuff that you know, I'm looking at you with your shelf of toys behind you, and all of this kind of stuff, all of that kind of idea that you can engage with what you see on TV at a greater depth through the merchandise. It's not just here's a spin-off thing. It's actually there's a, you know, it all connects and you get added value from the merchandise and stuff. That is him. And I find that absolutely extraordinary. And
yeah. Well, it is. I mean, even then, at that early stage of where television was, the birth of Doctor Who, he understood the value of involving the audience and having that participation and reaching out to the audience and making them feel they were part of the show.
Yeah.
It's incredible. What a guy.
Yeah.
Light years ahead of his time, no pun intended.
Yeah. And you know, and nobody knows who he is, and what we knew, what little even Doctor Who fans knew about him was not right.
Yeah. Well, it's a shame because, you know, when we were talking about you coming onto the show here, and I started thinking a bit more about it, and that's when I really realized, well, I don't know that much about him because we missed him. I do think, I wonder what he would have thought of this now in the 60th anniversary year had he you know, been with us now. I wonder what he would have made of it all.
So the day that he wrote to Gary Hopkins in October 1978.
Yeah.
I think I'm right on this. I'd need to double check, but I think that was the day that the first episode of The Stones of Blood went out.
All right.
Which was the 15th, kind of marked the 15th anniversary of Doctor Who. So he was aware that it was a lasting success. And he says in that letter something about all the people who've been in it have been very successful, which, although he doesn't say it outright, basically he's including Tom Baker in that. So he was aware of what was going on. The Stones of Blood was also the first Doctor Who story written by David Fisher, who David Whittaker had corresponded with in 1964 about writing Doctor Who.
How wonderful. I never knew that either.
So if he'd sat and watched that evening's Doctor Who, perhaps prompted by Gary Hopkins's letter, he would have seen David Fisher's name and gone, "Oh, that's a guy that I."
I hope he did. Isn't that a lovely thought to think that he was just around at that point after the football, and he would have put that on and thought, "Oh, love that, Simon."
And then later that year, the following month, the BBC Enterprises held a party.
Oh yes,
mark 15 years of Doctor Who. There's a couple of photos that survive.
Yeah, with John and Tom and Patrick and Katie and them and all that sort of stuff. Philip Hinchcliffe in the back. Yeah, another ones. Yeah.
Yeah, there's some evidence that David Whittaker got invited to that.
Oh, do you think he went?
I think that would explain a few things.
Okay.
I think that would that would fit with him then working with Malcolm Hulke on something else. But if they were both at that party, that would fit. It would explain a couple of things that Terence Dicks said in later interviews about David Whittaker's later life. It would explain something David Fisher told Paul Hayes, who's written Pull to Open, about David's later life. So yeah, nothing concrete, but certainly he was invited. There's pretty good evidence of that. And I think probably he went. So there's the odd thought of David Whittaker meeting Douglas Adams, who at the time was script editor of Doctor Who.
My goodness!
But was also, while script editor of Doctor Who, required under contract to write a novelization of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah.
The only person who could kind of go, "What, you were script editor and you were writing a novelization?" That's going to be Terence Dicks and David Whittaker. They both did that as well. So, imagine that conversation.
Well, I can imagine. I mean, from those couple of pictures that hopefully a lot of us have seen of that 15th birthday party, basically. I mean, imagine being there. I'd love the idea of all these people actually networking, talking to each other, coming up with ideas with each other, sorting out, swapping phone numbers. I mean, come on. I mean, yeah. I mean, I would. Oh, I mean, it's a joy, really, isn't it? You know, the fact that there it was back then, on the 15th anniversary, and here we are now on the 60th, looking at it.
Oh, to eavesdrop on the gossip.
Can you imagine being a fly on the wall, Simon?
Yeah. I think of little else.
Yeah. And just for the entertainment of having Tom Baker and John Pertwee in the same room at the same time, teasing each other. I mean, as well as all these lovely things about the actual, writers and directors and stuff being there, doing all these wonderful. Oh man, it would. Oh, I love that story, and I'm sure. Yeah, I like to think he went. I like to think he was there. I mean, why wouldn't you be?
Yeah, 11 knees up.
Well, yeah, exactly, and it was all paid for by the license fee payer. Why?
No, it wasn't. It was BBC Enterprises. Yeah, it was Enterprises.
Oh, it was Enterprises that did it, right?
It was paid for by overseas sales.
Oh well, good for them. That's even better then, isn't it? And you celebrating the success of the show that they would have all been in on the birth of.
Yeah.
15 years later, I think he would have been absolutely gobsmacked if he'd been here today.
Yeah. And proud, but his letter to Gary Hopkins is he takes no credit for it. It's all, he just says other people. It's a really characteristic
very modest
thing. Yeah, and he just says, William Hartnell was the reason it was such a success. Verity Lambert was brilliant. The Daleks were worthy of Jules Verne. This kind of stuff. And just pats it away, which is what he did in a lot of interviews about other things as well.
Absolutely incredible. It's incredible. There's obviously a lot more that's going to be in your book as well. So let's talk about it. The book is available right now, and you can get it, as the scroll has been saying all through this. You can get it from 10acrefilms.bigcartel.com. It's David Whittaker in an exciting adventure with television, written by my lovely guest here, Simon. Available right now, as I say, from there. The scroll is carrying up for you. You do have another version available, though, as well, don't you? For people that are interested, it's this one. So tell us about this one.
So this is the exclusive hardback edition, exclusive to the Who Shop, and it's obviously in reference to the very first edition of David's Dalek book, which is also shocking pink, and which you can see there. I don't have an original. This is the BBC Books reprint from 2017. I'm a writer.
It's as near as we're going to find, though, isn't it? Really, let's face it. Yeah.
So it's a hardback edition, a limited edition, exclusively for the Who Shop, just to excite it. Basically, Stuart Manning at 10 Acre Films and I, we in our efforts to have a marketing scheme, we were basically going, how can we do Barbie Oppenheimer? And this is the Barbie Oppenheimer of Doctor Who.
You make me laugh, you do. That's brilliant. That's fantastic. So you've got all these lovely variants available to you. You can get the book there from 10acrefilms.bigcartel.com, and then you can get that pink Barbie version from the Who Shop, our friends over at the Who Shop there, which is thewhoshop.com, and that's the exclusive version to them.
And I will be at the Who Shop on the 11th of November signing copies if people want to come along.
There you go. So if you're watching this, before the 11th, go and see Simon. Go and say hello. Tell him you saw him from this. And if you're watching it after the 11th, tough. You've missed him.
Well, you can still go to the Who Shop and buy stuff. And
of course you can. Absolutely.
Most importantly, my books. That's the thing.
And if you are anywhere else, don't forget that you can. I'll just do it again for you. There's the website for you again. It's 10acrefilms.bigcartel.com. Oh, Simon, do you know what? Thank you so much for spending some time coming to talk to me here on Who's Views Merchandise Paradise. It's been an absolute joy. I cannot wait, I have to tell you, to read this. I'm really looking forward to this. And again, it's added to the 10 Alps catalogue for 2023, which is absolutely fantastic. We've covered a lot of the stuff here on the Merchandise Paradise playlist with a lot of the authors that have taken part this year, but this is going to be another one to add to the shelf about the history of Doctor Who. And it just is, I can't wait. Even
yeah,
even
I
just to
mean,
get it on the shelf, Simon.
what a thrill to be in the same class as Paul Hayes's Pull to Open and Graham Kilbright's book on the typology of Doctor Who. You know, I'm excited to read that latter one. I've got Pull to Open.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's very exciting. Exciting times.
Well, it is, and it's been a great production from 10 Ups this year. As I say, they're just absolutely stunning, and they all look at this particular area as well in this big 60th anniversary year. Congratulations to yourself, your fellow authors. I'm not kidding you. I can't wait to see your book coming through the door, and I can't wait to read it. I will be feeding back what I think about it, Simon. I'll give you an email.
Do.
So again, thank you so much for joining me. A real pleasure to talk to you. You're welcome back anytime, of course. And thank you for watching this chat with Simon here on Who's Views Merchandise Paradise. Please do like the video. Please don't forget to share it as much as possible to put the news that Simon's book is out now and available from 10 Acre Films, or an exclusive edition, the big pink copy from the Who shop. Please put the word out for us there in this Doctor Who's 60th anniversary year, and in this very special Diamond Anniversary month. I hope you've enjoyed the show. Thank you for watching us. Again, thank you to Simon. And until we see you again next time, take care. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.